I just moved to North Dakota to work the oil field business with my friend I'll call Sean. I was initially unsure of what the job entails, but I knew it meant a lot of income and being able to see and work, and my longtime friend sold me on the deal. As it turned out, I loved the job. 12-hour days and on day shift, but the kind of money we were making was the easiest street in my opinion. I mean, basically, all we did during the day was stay on site and make sure the place didn't burn down. The job was perfect. This all came to a halt one day when my boss came to me and asked if I wanted to work night shift instead, and even go around to different sites. We all know, if your boss is asking, it's likely not smart to say no. So, I accepted. Basically, I checked 6 sites, 3 times a night, with 2 hours of downtime between each site check. Now, to give you an idea of the placement of these sites, just imagine sites at least 12 miles apart, sometimes further, in the middle of nowhere, with only old farms and some dirt roads near them for miles. That's how these sites were, and how alone I'd be while out that night. One other thing is winter was just setting in, so we had constant snow and blizzards. Now that you've got a great visual of my situation, I will begin to explain an experience I had while working the night shift. There's one site out of all the sites that is particularly creepy. This site is the farthest one away on my route, and is in the most dimly lit of all of them. Arriving at the said site, I pull up to the pump house, put on my gloves, my hard hat, switching my line out as I do, and step outside. Walking around, I'm careful with my steps as the headlight only illuminates what you're looking at. Everything else is a pitch black, cold, snowy abyss. The thing about the snow is you can tell if anyone has been around or is around, but there were no truck tracks, so I knew I was alone. My usual search goes from left to right, looking closely for leaks or potential leak areas on the tanks, which are roughly 20 feet by 10 feet wide. As I'm coming up on my last tank, I notice what looked like a pair of white tennis shoes dart behind a tank. My first thought is, what would anyone be doing out here without a truck? This made my stomach sink, partially out of confusion, but mostly because I was 20 miles away from civilization, alone, and it was like 15 degrees outside. The thought again crosses my mind. What would any sane person be doing out here without his truck? Slowly, and quite hesitantly, I go toward the tank I saw the shoe from. I'm taking it slow, one step at a time, and I'm beginning to feel on edge at this point. Just when my heart feels like it's about to explode a tiny bit, a white rabbit comes out hopping from the area. I throw my head back, breathe a sigh of relief, and have a laugh of the realization that it was just a bunny. This being the end of the line, I find a place to park soon after and kick back in my seat to relax. You need to understand, sleeping on the job isn't something you're supposed to do, but it happens sometimes, and before I knew it, I passed out. 40 minutes later, my body spazzes awake and I look around to see no one. Needing to pee, I step out, but before I can even step on the ground, I freeze. There are tracks in the snow, leading up to my truck. These aren't rabbit tracks either. They're human-like. They aren't the right size to be mine either. The tracks lead over to the tanks I was checking earlier. I question, who the hell could be out here and why? I began to get that sinking feeling again as I followed the tracks. I made sure to grab the biggest wrench I had from the truck just in case. Whoever was out here, were they crazy? Did they potentially need my help? I wasn't sure, and about 20 feet from the dark tank, I freeze and call out, asking who's there and if they need any help. Silence sets in for a minute, the only sound coming from the snow and the wind blowing it. I feel simultaneous loneliness, and yet, I know I'm potentially being watched. The loneliness is the realization I'm on my own, and if something goes wrong, I'm probably screwed. Trying to set this thought aside, I tried to tell whoever is back there I'm aware they're there. Still, silence is the only response I get. I walk forward 5 more feet and peer around the tank area. What I see doesn't register immediately, but when it does, I'm in shock. There's blood. And I mean lots of blood. I felt nauseous, but was curious, so I stepped closer. That's when I see an antler. Is it a deer? Finally, I make my way close enough to see a dead deer. Its throat slit and blood everywhere. The thing was, its organs were in clear display as well. It's streaming on the snow, so I know the kill was fresh. Someone or something had eviscerated this deer and left it here. Who or what would do this, and why? I turn my attention back to the shoe prints, and while it's obvious there was a lot of shuffling around the deer itself, I'm not convinced, just yet, that whoever was there was responsible for killing the deer. This was then I noticed the shoe prints leading off and back to the tanks. Slowly, extremely hesitantly now, I follow these tracks. I'm shaking, but not from the snow. No, I'm shaking from fear. The tracks themselves appear to be blood red. The tracks lead to a drop-off, and I peer off into the distance. When 40 feet away, I see something that makes me damn near shit myself. The thing I see is half of a human face peering back at me from over the hill. The face was old, tattered, with long, mangy hair and blood from the nose down. I jumped so hard I fell, but was immediately on my feet seconds later. I threw my stuff into my truck bed, got into my truck, and floored it as far and fast as I could. I was dizzy and couldn't help but think that that thing had been right outside my unlocked truck door, looking at me while I slept at one point. If it didn't already have the deer, would it have done what it did to the deer to me? I never told my company about the person or thing that I saw. I simply told them I noticed the deer and thought it was strange. At which point, they removed the body. An older resident of the area, who was on site that day, mentioned it looked like a couple coyotes got to it and were trying to drag it out of the predator's sight. I knew better though. I still work with the company. Until this day, I still work nights and have to check in on this site. I'm always in and out in minutes and never linger, nor do I sleep out there.
So I live in a very wooded area. I'm a 21-year-old female and I live with my grandparents and two of my brothers on the very top of a huge mountain with nothing but trees on all sides. Now, I have lived here since I was able to walk, and I know these woods like the back of my hand. When I was little, my brothers and I basically lived in these hills from sunrise to sunset. We found some pretty cool things and have been freaked out a few times from coyotes and snakes. A few months ago, we saw something that still gives me goosebumps just from riding it. Honestly, I don't have a clue what it was and we haven't seen it since. But like I said, our house sets on a huge mountain, and there is a decent-sized field right below our house, and we can see the whole field from our porch. My brother and I walked out on the porch at around 11 p.m. to smoke a cigarette, since our grandparents don't allow it in the house. It was just starting to rain and you could hear the crickets and all the little creatures at night, and I absolutely loved it. So, we're sitting on this porch just talking, smoking, and listening to the rain, and all at once, everything stopped. And I mean everything stopped, except a small, constant drop of water. The best way I can describe the dripping was that it was an echo and remained constant, like it never sped up or slowed down. My brother looked over to me because he heard the sound too, so we stood up to look around for the source of the sound, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from, and my brother tapped me on the shoulder and whispered, "What the hell was that?" I turned over to see where he was pointing, and I saw it down in the field. It was easy to see because I walked right into the middle of the moonlight. It was huge. I say about 7.5 feet tall at least. It was kinda hunched over and walked on two legs. Its skin was very pale and it didn't look like it had fur or anything, but a white light shimmered from it brighter than the moonlight. It walked like it was in slow motion and then it just stops and looks directly at us. It didn't even have facial features, but we could both feel its stare somehow. It never moved, and I've never ran so fast in my life. We hightailed it into the house, but when we looked out the window, it was going back into the woods. We haven't seen it since, But last night my brother heard the dripping noise from his bedroom. That's what made me want to write this. I just want to know what this thing is. I don't believe we're endangered though, because there was a time for it to attack, it would have been that night. If you know what this is, I'd really appreciate knowing. This happened when I was 12 or 13 years old. I live in southern Michigan, and a lot of strange things happen in these woods. So, little backstory here. My dad and I volunteered for a bird banding station. Bird banding is where a researcher catches a bird and puts a tiny numbered band on its leg to study its migration patterns. We were careful to not hurt the birds, so we set up mist nets to catch them, rather than a traditional trap. They were always released in the end. The lamb we banded on was owned by the head researcher, let's call him R. R's property was massive, with forest, marshlands, countryside, you name it. I loved to explore it while the banders were tagging birds. However, something happened that made me be more cautious when out in the woods alone. It was a slow summer morning, and I was walking through the forest enjoying the day. All of a sudden, I hear this wailing sound. It sounded like a distressed deer or even a cat. Being the big animal lover I was, I went looking for the wounded animal. It wasn't long before I came to the edge of the property. Something was wrong, however. The noise sounded much farther away than it did before. The woods around me were also completely silent. I happened to look to my left to see a hunter's blind. Once again, I got closer. I noticed something bizarre. It was badly torn on the sides, as if someone got a knife and sliced into it. Suddenly, I hear the same distant wailing sound again. So I did something stupid. I made the noise right back at the thing, hoping that whatever it was would show itself. Not even 5 minutes later, I hear this low growling noise just about 20 yards to my left. Even after wandering the woods for most of my life, I've never heard a sound like that before. I had to get out of there. I made a run for R's house, and it wasn't long before I came to his yard, and I stopped to catch my breath. All of a sudden, I hear the same low growl coming from the bushes less than 10 yards away, so I ran all the way up to the research shed to find R. It wasn't long before I told him what I had heard. I told him that possibly a deer had growled at me. He was a very scientific guy after all, and I doubted he'd believe me. But, in the back of my mind, I knew this was no deer. I believed that whatever this was trying to lure me off the property and do who knows what. A few days later, I learned about skinwalkers and how they mimicked animal sounds and even voices to lure people to their deaths. Although I luckily never saw this thing, I believe it was a skinwalker looking for its next victim. This is my grandmother's story from when she was living in Czechoslovakia. When she was younger, she lived in a village near a forest. She had friends in the far but neighboring village and regularly went there to play table tennis. The village had a road around the forest where you could cut through it and can get there in half the time. Everything was normal, but my grandmother had stayed longer than she was allowed to, and it became night. This was before phones, and she knew where her mom would be, and she knew that she would be very angry coming home so late. She started walking home, cutting through the forest, something she did quite often, when suddenly she had a bad feeling and felt like she was being watched. She had all of a sudden noticed that the forest was silent and had become, like, somehow infested with a pungent odor as she couldn't even describe. She said it gave her an overwhelming fear, which was made even worse when suddenly hearing a noise. Scared, she was hugging a tree until the feeling passed, but soon she realized that she couldn't stop hugging the tree. Tried to pull away from the tree, but it would not let go. Finally, it let her go and she flew home. Upon arriving home, she knocked on the door and her mother answered, very angry, and she started apologizing. Her mom started yelling at her for not replying to her when she got home. My grandmother tried to explain that she had not only just got home now, but her mother wasn't listening to what she had been saying. My grandmother doesn't know what happened back in Czechoslovakia, and I don't either. I have never heard a story like it before, and I'm not so sure this is even a monster, or maybe even counts as a sighting. This story scares me more than anything else because the woods, they just seem to hold so many mysteries. Whether this was some creepy spiritual monster or just a paranoid little girl, we'll never know, I guess. But thanks for sharing my story anyway.
Alright, so I live in Kansas in a small town just outside of Topeka. Now, there are many little rumors about spooky things that happen around here, but one of them I saw with my very own eyes. There is an RV park just outside the town, and me and my friend went exploring. I told him to come with me because often nights on walks I hear or occasionally see something odd. I took him to the spot I saw it, and we hid and waited. Then, when I checked on the spot, there it was. A hairless, dark creature that had arms and legs but used all their limbs as legs. Its legs bent backwards like a grasshopper and had almost garden rake-like hands. It also had yellow eyes. I told my friend that I see it. We looked and there it was, slouched over and almost like it was eating something. We decided to leave and slowly back away. I stepped on a leaf and this thing turned and looked at me. It heard me. The creature stared, and we backed away slightly faster and turned to run when we heard a scream. A horrifying scream, almost like a bat screech and a tire squealing combined. We immediately bolted it out of there, but I swear the screaming followed us. I heard scuttling, like something running freakishly fast on all fours. I looked back into my horror. This thing was scurrying in a twisted, deformed manner towards us. We ran faster, and just when I was sure we were going to get caught, the screaming and the creature stopped. I looked back one more time and watched it fade into the distance. I refused to stop running, and eventually we made it back to my house and locked the door. I opened my window a crack to see if I could hear anything when I heard rustling in the trees. I looked up to see the yellow eyes hidden in the trees. I locked up the house terrified and never spoke of it again. And luckily, that was the last time I ever saw those yellow, glowing eyes. This story starts at my mom's place in Ohio. I was 11, and I've always believed in things like Bigfoot. At this point in time, I'm at my mom's house spending time with her boyfriend, and my brother. My parents being divorced, it was nice to finally get a week off to be able to go out and visit her. One morning, we all get up and go to Raccoon Park. My family is fishing there, when our dog, Rue, runs off. I go off in search of Rue, and while looking for him, I notice some boats. I grab Rue and return him to our family. My mom and I decide to take one of the boats onto the river. They aren't fancy. They're just those little pedal boats that you can rent. While pedaling, we decide to go to the other side of the bank, near a forest, to see if we can find some fish. As we got closer, we began to hear rustling in the trees. We didn't think much of it initially. We figured it was probably another person or maybe a raccoon or some other animal. Eventually, we narrowed down the possibility to an animal, as people weren't really in the area we were at. This was when something fell from the tree. We thought maybe a squirrel, but that's when we noticed there weren't any squirrels around. Then, out of the blue, a huge log flies by us and lands just super close to our boats. Freaking out, we immediately pedal away and back to the boathouse. As we were heading back, I looked behind me and noticed a 9-foot-tall hairy creature watching us from the trees on the bank. Shortly after, I noticed the creature. It darted off into the forest, never to be seen again. I initially thought I was hallucinating until some people in the park, on the bank, asked if I saw what was across the way while pedaling back. 2 weeks later, I'm video chatting my mom and she mentions 2 guys took a pedal boat out by the area we were at. And while they were there, something attacked them from out of nowhere. They weren't hurt, more spooked, but they did get a decent glimpse of this creature. I'll never be sure what it was. but I'll always believe it was Bigfoot. My name is Clara. I live in the upper state of Michigan, and I love to hike and camp along with some hunting. I went out one day with my stepdad to go hunting so we could catch us some deer and whatnot. Once we got to the location where we went to go hunt at, we got out and packed up our gear we had brought from our house. I smelled something foul like a pile of garbage or rotting fish mixed with some really bad body odor. We ignored it as we thought something might be dead laying around nearby. We made our way through the woods onto a beaten down path we had found close by. Once we got quite a ways, we stopped and took a couple of minutes. After we took our small break, we heard a huge crack in the background behind some large bushes. My stepdad instinctively grabbed his sidearm from his holster. And that is when whatever it was growled at us and sped off. Whatever it was sounded huge and very fast. We, of course, ignored it, but hiked even faster to where we needed to go. Once we got there, we set up camp and started to make lunch. We had a hot dog with a side of salad. As we ate, I started to smell that putrid smell again, which almost made me vomit my food back out. I had to pee, so I went off being near dusk. I grabbed my flashlight and a hunting knife to take as protection just in case. I squatted down as I was about to take a pee, until I saw something move off in the distance. Freaked out, I shined my flashlight at whatever it was. I could see orange or red glowing eyes shining as I stared at something, and I started to become even more frightened than I was before. I pulled my pants back up and ran back to the camp. I told my dad about what happened, and he went to check it out. Only after a couple of minutes, I heard a loud scream the direction my dad had run off into. He ran back panicked, real bad with blood oozing down his knee. I asked him what happened, but he stayed silent. He packed up our stuff as fast as he could and walked fast back to the truck. Once we got halfway there, we heard a very loud call from something I've never heard before. At that moment, we started running as fast as we could, nearly tripping over roots until after a couple of minutes or so, we finally made it back to the truck. We packed everything in the back and sped off. We went straight home, and we tried to go straight to sleep. But before that, I saw his knee, which looked like it was hit by a big rock or something. He still hasn't told me what happened, but I do have a very, very bad feeling that he got into a tussle with something out in those woods.
I'm 13 and I just moved to a rural area in Holland with my family. Even as a child, I was never your typical girl. I was quite tomboyish and even would play with worms, mud, and at times even dead animals. Now though, I had 4 acres of wooded area to explore, so my German shepherds and I were very excited. After dinner one night, I told my parents I was taking the boys out back to play. The first thing I did was let Max and Riley do their business near the house, and then off we went to explore. Around the side of the garage was a cornfield. We walked alongside this until we reached a dirt mound. I chose to climb over this, but Max and Riley decided using the cornfield was the best route into the woods. Once an opening in the field appeared, my 2 dogs would join me. Upon arrival in the woods, I made sure to keep Max close as he would defend me. Riley, on the other hand, was a big baby and would run at the first sight of anyone new, so I left him on his own devices. Anyway, the boys and I continued deeper into the woods. Inside, there was a huge hill you could see from my house, and the boys and I began climbing it. When we reached the top, we chilled for a bit while Max played with the rock and Riley darted around paranoidally. I'd heard things about goatmen and other cryptids, but being a seeing is believing type of person, I wasn't worried about that sort of thing while out in the woods. After our short break, I decided to climb down the hill and head back to feed my neighbor's chickens. As I'm climbing down, I tell Max to follow us, and as I turn my head to the right, I notice a tall grass is now moving. The realization that both my dogs are to the left of me hits hard, and I quickly scramble out of there. My dogs, knowing something was up, follow close behind me without even having to ask. I'm spooked by all this, and, be sure, as I type this out, decided against a normal policy of leaving my blinds open when I crash at night. Something strange while running. I looked back and I noticed that these things that were coming out of the bushes seemed to be similar to what these things that are called melonheads are. They're supposed to roam the rural areas around Allegheny County. I don't know if that was for sure it, but I'll never go out in those woods alone again, just in case it was those melonheads. I don't know if they're evil or not, but the stories are definitely creepy. The following story happened when I was 10. It has remained in the back of my mind and in dreams for years after. As a kid, I'd often stack my toys on my windowsill and play with them. My window looked out to the front lawn, and I always loved the view. I also was a nosy kid, so I kind of liked seeing what was going on outside. Something about watching the neighbors go about their daily routines just made me feel safe, and I really did enjoy it. Sometimes, when bored, I'd even watch the animals we had around the area. The window I speak of was pretty big. It had a screen between the window and outside as well, which helped keep the cats from jumping out, as I'd often keep the window open, much like I had it today. On that day in question, I was just chilling in front of the window, reading, and also people watching and snooping where I could. As I'm reading, I suddenly get this sense something's watching me. Looking up, I see something standing there. It had the body of a man, the head of a jackal, and looked like a twisted version of Anubis, for a lack of better visual. This thing would just stand there, watching me, a sinister smile on its face as it did. I remember his ears were extremely pointed and would stick up as though he were on alert. I was frozen in place, afraid as the thing stared at me. This lasted for what seemed like an eternity before the thing finally lumbered off into a wooded lot next door. Once I was able to move again, I rushed for the front door to see if I could get a better view of the thing. To my surprise, it had simply disappeared. After this day, I never left my window open again. I kept the blinds closed, and even today, I keep the black curtains over them, refusing to look outside my window again. I'm still unsure of what that thing was, but it felt quite predatory. I'm just grateful I never saw it in person again, and I hope I never do. If any of you possibly have any idea what this thing could have been, I would love to know. When I was about 10 years old, my cousin who was 8 at the time and cousin who was 9 all stayed with me in my grandparents' house one night. My cousins lived at the end of the country, so we didn't see him very often, and he has some kind of social difficulties. He is awkward and has never been diagnosed, and was very needy compared to me and my brother. We were all staying in my grandmother's spare room, which had 2 twin beds which my brother and cousin slept in at one end of the rectangular-shaped room, while I was on the air mattress at the other end of the bedroom, which was directly opposite the bedroom door. My cousin got up whining. He was scared at the dark, and my grandma came upstairs and told him to go back to bed. She left the light on and the door halfway open, at which point we went back to bed. I remember being able to hear the TV downstairs, and my cousin was restless. I was awake but just tried to sleep. Not long later, I remember because I was still awake, I saw through the very dimly lit bedroom what I can only describe as a goblin or dwarf or something. It was only about 2 feet in height. Smacked the end of my cousin's head. I saw the silhouette of it run from the bedroom. It didn't move the door, it just sort of maneuvered through the opening. I remember hearing its footsteps as it ran out. I absolutely froze and just laid there, uncertain of what I saw for a moment. My heart was racing and my feet and palms were sweating, but I just froze. Seconds later, to my horror, my cousin got up, put the light on, and walked downstairs to see my grandma, complaining that something had banged on his head. The whole time I lay on the air mattress, now wanting to believe what I saw, I just saw my cousin whining, and it confirmed it to me. My grandmother came up and told him to stop being silly and go to bed. I didn't say a word, but I know what I saw. 20 years later, I could still remember the whole thing. My brother was fast asleep throughout. My grandma still lives in the house now. I have had some night terrors in that house when I was little, but other than that, I don't find anything particularly supernatural about it. They've never experienced anything like it before or since. I spoke about it with a friend years later and they said maybe it was a house demon. I'm honestly very unsure myself.
In the spring of 2017, I went to JDC, the Juvenile Detention Center. The jail I was in was called the Multi-County Juvenile Det Center. When I arrived at my temporary home, I was placed in a cell in Delta 3, which is on the ground floor. In my cell was a ground window, a toilet, and a water fountain. And that was it. The first night was just fine, or fine for being in jail. I slept all right, and nothing bothered me outside of being in jail. 2 weeks later, and on a sleepless night, I decided to get up and walk around my cell out of boredom. I began walking at around 3 in the morning, according to the clock. Looking out of my cell, I noticed there were no guards around. I assumed the guard was on break, and just continued to do my own thing. I mean, where was I gonna go, right? Eventually, I sat down and looked out of my ground floor window. I tranced out for a moment when something caught my attention that snapped me back to reality. The jail is out near the woods, so the window looks out to the tree line. While watching the horizon, I noticed something on all fours crawling in the distance. The thing I saw wasn't like any animal out there. It was completely pale, had 2 black eyes, and a slit for a mouth. This freaked me out and I gasped, backing away from the cell as I did. I pushed the emergency button on my cell and waited for the guards. I moved back to the window while waiting and saw the thing run back into the woods. When the guards arrived, I tried to explain the situation, which didn't help anything, of course. In fact, they said I was bored and trying to start a commotion, and because of that, they wrote me up and extended my sentence. Due to my write-up, I was forced to stay in my cell for 24 hours for the next few days. I spent days just thinking about what I saw and sitting there afraid. I was also pissed about my situation. I believe in monsters to this day. Years ago, I used to backpack around the States. I was in New Mexico searching for elusive ditches and pools to skateboard. I got a few directions from locals and it's free for all to find these places. Some were sketchy with crackheads and weirdos and others are invite only. So I've been searching all day in Gallup. It's a solitary pool next to a trailer park. I speak with the owners and they said it was cool for me to camp here. Just be inside your tent at night. I didn't ask why out of obliviousness and poor hearing. I thanked them and skate all day till dusk. I had a bottle of Jim Beam, and I was psyched about where I was as a self-reflection. Little did I know I'd be terrified later that night. I'm getting hammered and singing songs and laughing. Suddenly, I hear a loud scream. It was like when you're angry and spaz out when skateboarding. It sounded like my voice, as I slammed earlier, like it was me, but tinny, like speaking in a fan, like that hollow and echoey sound. I had heard of skinwalkers, but assumed it was a Native American boogeyman as I am white. I had no idea it would be real. I stayed in my tent most of the night. However, I did hear scurrying about, mouth-breathing smells of rotten meat and snorting, like it was sniffing the area. I asked the owners the next day what the hell that thing was. They said, "Oh, you heard them?" They did a protective ritual and put up a talisman for warding them off. They told me of others who skate this spot having had very similar experiences. However, I won't be going anywhere near that spot anytime soon. I will conclude with this. I am an adventurous type and a daredevil at heart. That said, I've been through way too much in the city to mess with supernatural entities. I'd take stabbings, robbery, being shot twice, mangled by a friend on flocka and bath salts, and getting jumped any day. I would rather face those sketchy human moments than skinwalkers as I've won some and lost some. But in my experience reading these stories online, I don't think skinwalkers lose too often.